Agnes, Clara, Leo, Mr. Davies, Marcus Thorne. The attic air hung thick, a palpable thing, heavy with the scent of dust motes caught dancing in the thin shafts of weary afternoon light. And something else beneath that, the papery, slightly sweet, almost melancholy smell of memories left undisturbed for far too long. 77 years. That's how long I, Agnes, though most who knew me in my younger days called me Aggie, a name I shed like an ill-fitting coat decades ago, have walked this earth. And it felt like at least half that time, a solid 4 decades perhaps, had been spent accumulating the things now piled around me in this forgotten, liminal space between the ceilings of my life and the roof above. Old photo albums I never opened, stacks of linens yellowed at the folds, furniture draped in ghostly white sheets, the silent archaeology of a life lived largely for others. My daughter Clara insisted it was time to downsize. Sensible, she called it, her voice always carrying that faint, almost imperceptible edge of impatience, as if my sprawling old house and its contents were a personal affront to her organized, efficient world. Practical. Clara lives and breathes sensible and practical. She manages spreadsheets for a living. She manages life the same way, neat columns and predictable, unlike me, or at least, unlike the girl I used to be, the one buried somewhere beneath the sensible, practical layers I donned like necessary winter clothing. My hip twinged as I knelt stiffly beside a precarious stack of old hat boxes, their floral patterns faded like old regrets. The familiar ache, a dull companion these days, provided a monotonous counterpoint to the sudden sharp pang of, what was it? Regret? Certainly. A constant low hum beneath the surface of my days? Longing? Yes, that too. A vague, formless yearning for something unnamed, something lost, or perhaps never found. It often ambushed me, that feeling, a phantom limb of emotion, usually when faced with these remnants of a life that felt increasingly like someone else's biography. Thomas, my late husband, had been gone 10 years now. A decade. A good man, everyone said so. Steady, kind, reliable as the sunrise, but not one for, well, not one for the wild bursts of color that used to paint my own inner world. Not like the attic air, thick and still with forgotten things. Clara wanted me in a sensible apartment, one of those modern boxes with beige walls and minimal upkeep. Smaller, easier to manage, closer to her and Leo, my grandson. Leo, a whirlwind of gangly teenage limbs, baffling slang I pretended to understand, and eyes perpetually glued to the glowing screen of his phone. A good boy, I thought, but distant, orbiting a digital world I couldn't enter. Did he even know his quiet gray-haze grandmother used to dream in Technicolor, that she once held brushes slick with potential, her heart thrumming with the vibrant pulse of creation? I doubted it. To him I was probably just grandma, dependable, predictable, sensible. My fingers, thin now, the skin like worn parchment over bone, brushed against wood. Not the rough texture of cardboard. Wood. Smooth, cool beneath the layers of dust, tucked beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets smelling faintly of lavender and thyme, was a small, dark wooden box, plain, unassuming, maybe mahogany or walnut, impossible to tell under the grime, but heavy, solid, and locked. A tiny, tarnished brass lock gleamed dully in the weak light. I didn't recognize it. My heart gave a curious little flutter, a startled bird in my ribs. Where had this come from? It wasn't Thomas's. He preferred metal strongboxes, practical things for practical papers. This felt different, personal. With a grunt that betrayed my stiff joints, I pulled it free, the displaced dust making me sneeze. It was heavier than it looked. I sat back on my heels, turning it over in my hands. No markings, no carvings, just a simple wooden rectangle holding what? Forgotten letters? Old jewelry? Maybe secrets Thomas had kept. The thought sent another, less pleasant flutter through me. I rummaged through a nearby tin, the one overflowing with orphaned keys, keys to long-gone padlocks, forgotten suitcases, doors and houses we no longer lived in. The jangle echoed loudly in the cathedral quiet of the attic. The first key didn't fit. The second scraped uselessly. Third try. A soft, definitive click echoed in the stillness. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I hadn't realized I was reading. My breath hitched. Suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was inside. Some doors, perhaps, are better left closed, but the curiosity, that old spark I thought long extinguished, was stronger. I lifted the lid slowly, hesitantly. Inside was a ghost. More than a ghost. A whole buried lifetime. Small, dried, cracked tubes of watercolor paint, their paper labels faded and peeling, but the names still faintly legible. Cadmium red, viridian green, brushes, their bristles stiff and splayed like forgotten dancers, frozen mid-pose. A cracked white ceramic palette, irrevocably stained with the colorful ghosts of paintings never finished, or perhaps long since left, and beneath them, nestled like sacred texts, sketchbooks. 2 of them, leather-bound, the covers worn soft as suede at the edges, the pages brittle with time. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen these things, hadn't allowed myself to see them. In 50 years? 60? It felt like another lifetime entirely. My hands trembled as I reached in, my fingers brushing against the hardened tubes of stiff bristles. It was like touching a phantom limb. Gently, reverently, I lifted the topmost sketchbook. The leather felt supple beneath my aged fingers, a familiar texture that sent a jolt of pure memory through me, sharp and unexpected. The air suddenly smelled not just of dust, but faintly of linseed oil and turpentine, phantom scents from a past I'd locked away with this box. Hesitantly, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird, I opened it. Drawings exploded from the pages, leaping out at me with a vitality that felt almost shocking in the dim, still attic. Quick, energetic lines capturing the dramatic sweep of a windswept coastline. I recognized it instantly. The cliffs near Haven Point where I'd spent a summer sketching as a girl. Detailed, almost obsessively rendered studies of wildflowers, columbine, Indian paintbrush, wild iris, their delicate petals and intricate veins captured with a tenderness that spoke of hours spent in quiet observation. Landscapes filled with light and shadow, movement and stillness. And then the portraits, faces I hadn't allowed myself to conjure in decades. My own face, younger, fiercer, the eyes alight with a passionate intensity I barely recognized. And his, Marcus Thorne, my old art teacher, my mentor. His face, captured in charcoal, looked back at me from the page, sharp-featured, a strong jawline, dark hair falling slightly over his forehead, and those eyes, intense, intelligent, holding a gaze that seemed to pierce right through the paper, through the years. Seeing him again, even in charcoal, felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. Tucked carefully between the pages, like pressed flowers, were letters. Folded, fragile, the paper thin as a butterfly's wing, written in Marcus's familiar, elegant script, the ink faded but still legible. I unfolded one, my fingers clumsy with a sudden tremor. "Agnes, my dearest Agnes," the words leapt out, intimate and startling after so long. "Your use of light is astonishing. It's not just technique, it's feeling. You paint sunlight as if you've held it in your hands. Don't ever let anyone dim it." I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. Another letter, dated a few months later. "Saw your latest piece at the student exhibition. Bold, fearless. You have a voice, Agnes, a unique way of seeing. Don't let the academics or the critics box you in. Trust your own vision." And then a third, the paper even more brittle. "Talent like yours is a responsibility, Agnes, a gift. Don't squander it on sensible things. The world needs your colors." A responsibility I had abdicated, a gift I had buried. Why? Why had I locked this all away? The memories rushed back, sharp and unwelcome, like shards of glass underfoot. Giving up my scholarship to the Art Institute, marrying Thomas, the sensible choice, the safe harbor. Flexible life that followed, raising Clara, managing the household, decades measured out in cups of the gradual fading of color, the slow, insidious creep of gray, until everything felt muted, muffled, sensible, like the dust motes dancing in the attic air, going nowhere, signifying nothing. A sudden fierce ache bloomed in my chest, a physical pain mirroring the emotional one, a longing so intense it stole my breath. I traced the lines of that charcoal self-portrait again, the girl with fire in her eyes, defiance in the set of her jaw, passion in the curve of her lips. What had happened to her? Where had she gone? Had I simply let her starve, locked away in this dusty box on this dusty shelf? Downstairs, the phone rang again, sharp and insistent, startling me out of the past. Clara, undoubtedly, checking up, making sure I was fulfilling my sensible duty of dismantling my own life, piece by piece. I ignored it, let it ring. My hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, trembled as I reached for one of the stiff brushes. It felt alien in my grip, unMarie Alex's still pliable inside its hardened casing. With shaking fingers I unscrewed the cap and squeezed a tiny, perfect bead of brilliant blue onto the cracked palette. An old jam jar stood nearby, half filled with murky rainwater that must have dripped through a crack in the roof ages ago. I dipped the brush into the water, swirled it into the paint. The color came alive, vibrant, electric. Then, tentatively, heart-pounding, I touched the tip of the brush to a blank page at the back of the sketchbook. The blue bled onto the paper, a whisper at first, watery and pale, then deepening, spreading into a patch of defiant color against the gray, time-worn page. It wasn't much, a clumsy stroke, a hesitant mark, but it was something. A breath held for 60 years, finally released, a whisper of the girl I used to be, a possibility. A tear slid down my cheek, hot and startlingly real, not a tear of sadness this time. Not entirely. It was mixed with something else, something sharp, fierce, and terribly, undeniably alive. The girl with fire in her eyes. Maybe she wasn't gone. Maybe she was just sleeping, locked away in this box, waiting for me to find the key. I stayed up there for hours, lost in a timeless space, not painting properly, not yet, just remembering, touching the colors, rereading the letters, feeling the ghostly echo of a passion I thought had turned to dust long ago. When I finally forced myself to come downstairs, the house was dark, steeped in shadows. Sensible Clara hadn't called back. Perhaps she'd given up for the day. The wooden box now sat on the floor beside my armchair, an incongruous object in my tidy, predictable living room. It felt like a challenge, a question I couldn't ignore. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of color, heard the echo of Marcus's words. Don't squander it on sensible things. The next morning, I did something utterly impractical, something the Agnes of the past few decades would never have contemplated. Ignoring the neat piles of items destined for donation, ignoring the mental checklist Clara had undoubtedly prepared for me, I put on my coat, grabbed my purse, and walked downtown. I walked past the sensible shoe store, the practical hardware shop, the tidy little bakery Clara approved of. My steps carried me further, towards the older, slightly more cluttered part of town, until I stood before a small, unassuming storefront squeezed between a used bookstore and a dusty pawn shop. Davies's Antiques. The window was crammed with a chaotic assortment of objects. Tarnished silver, chipped porcelain dolls, faded paintings in ornate frames, a brass telescope pointing accusingly at the sky. It looked less like a shop and more like the attic I had just escaped, only curated by a magpie with eccentric tastes. Mr. Davies, the proprietor, was a local legend of sorts, a man who looked as old and dusty as his wares. Tweed jacket perpetually shedding lint, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, a face etched with lines that seemed to hold the history of the town, and an expression of permanent, low-crumping gruppingness. Rumor had it he knew everything about local history, particularly anything related to art or artists who had passed through our town decades ago. I clutched a small, hardened tube of viridian green paint in my pockets, its familiar shape a small anchor in my sudden sea of uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door. Mr. Davies looked up from a massive leather-bound ledger spread open on the counter. He peered at me over his spectacles, his expression unchanging. A grunt served as his greeting. "Excuse me," I began, my voice feeling rusty, unused to initiating conversations outside the narrow confines of family matters. "Mr. Davies?" Another grunt. "Yes." His tone wasn't welcoming. "I was wondering." I fumbled in my pocket and produced the paint tube, placing it carefully on the cluttered counter between us. "Do you know anything about old art supplies? Watercolor paints from, well, from a very long time ago?" I hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Named Marcus Thorne." His eyes, magnified slightly behind the thick lenses, sharpened almost imperceptibly. He picked up the paint tube, turning it over and over in his gnarled, surprisingly deft fingers, examining the faded label. "Marcus Thorne," he murmured, the name tasting like old memories on his tongue, dusty and significant. Haven't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. My heart pounded against my ribs. This was it, a link, however tenuous. He taught me?" I stammered, feeling foolishly young again, a long time ago, when I was just a girl. Mr. Davies looked at me again, properly this time, a long, considering look that seemed to take in my gray hair, my sensible coat, my nervous hands. "Did he now?" he said, his voice raspy, like stones tumbling together. "Thought all his students gave up, moved on," especially after he paused, his gaze dropping back to the paint tube, which he began polishing absently on his sleeve. "Especially after he left." Left? The word snagged in my mind. Marcus hadn't just left. He had disappeared, vanished from my life, from the town, leaving behind only silence and the sharp, aching void of his absence. The story I carried, the one I had subconsciously edited and filed away over the years, was one of abrupt abandonment, of betrayal that had, perhaps, contributed to my own quiet retreat from the world of art, from the world of vibrant color. He didn't just leave," I found myself saying, confusion clouding my voice. "He vanished." Mr. Davies stopped polishing. He set the paint tube down with a soft click. "Vanished?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Not hardly. Came into some money, he did. Family inheritance, I heard tell. Packed his bags, bought a one-way ticket. Went off to Italy last I heard, chasing the light, I suppose. Never came back." "Italy? Money? Never came back?" The words spun in my head, colliding with the narrative I'd constructed over 60 years. It didn't fit. None of it. My memory, hazy and subjective as it might be, held a different ending. Sharp, painful, local. Not a casual departure to Europe funded by an inheritance. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach, tightening with dread. What did I remember? Or more accurately, what had I forced myself to forget, and why did the sensible, practical, gray life I'd built with Thomas, the life I'd accepted as my quiet destiny, suddenly feel like it was standing on the most unstable, treacherous ground imaginable? Had the foundations been flawed from the very beginning? Mr. Davis's words, Went off to Italy, never came back. Followed me home, rattling around in my head like loose stones in a box. They were sharp-edged, uncomfortable, refusing to settle. Italy? Marcus, the intense, passionate artist who spoke of responsibility and staying true to one's vision, had simply packed up and left for Italy? It felt wrong, utterly wrong. The story I held on to, fragmented and worn smooth by time like sea glass, was one of heartbreak rooted here in this town, an ending, not an escape. Had 60 years of quiet resignation blurred the edges of truth? Or was Mr. Davies mistaken? Or was there another possibility, one that made the knot in my stomach twist tighter? Had the story I remembered been deliberately altered, not just by the passage of time, but by someone else? The wooden box retrieved from the attic now sat on the small table beside my reading chair in the living room. It felt like a silent provocation, a tangible piece of a past I could no longer ignore. I found myself drawn to it throughout the day, lifting the lid, inhaling that faint scent of turpentine and dried pigment, touching the hardened paints, tracing the energetic lines in the sketchbook. The girl in the self-portrait stared back, her eyes challenging me. "What happened?" she seemed to ask. "What did you let them do to us?" The sensible thing would have been to put the box back in the attic, lock it away again, and focus on Clara's demands for downsizing. But the whisper of possibility, the defiant patch of blue I'd painted, had grown louder. I went out and bought a new set of watercolors, not expensive ones, just a student set and a proper pad of thick textured paper. My first attempts were humbling, dispiriting even. My hand felt clumsy, disconnected from my eye. The colors turned muddy under my hesitant brushstrokes. The fire I saw in the eyes of the girl in the sketch seemed impossibly distant, a galaxy away from the stiff, uncertain lines I was producing. Doubt, cold and insidious, began to seep in like damp rising through floorboards. This was foolish nostalgia. I was too old, too rusty. My time for painting, for passion, was long past. Clara called again, punctual as ever, her voice brisk with that familiar underlying impatience disguised as sensible concern. "Mom, have you started sorting the kitchen yet? I found a charity online that does pickups, but we need to schedule it. They need at least a week's notice." I looked at the half-finished, frankly disastrous watercolor of a rose sitting accusingly on my small work table. "I've been busy," I murmured, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. "Busy?" Her tone sharpened. "With what? Mom, you haven't been spending all your time on that painting nonsense, have you?" The word nonsense stung. We talked about this. Downsizing is the practical choice. It makes sense financially, logistically. "It doesn't feel like my choice, Clara," I said, the words surprising myself again with their quiet firmness. This time, they felt less like rebellion and more like simple truth. "This is still my home. My home." "Realistically, Mom, maintaining a house this size alone," Clara started, launching into her usual litany of practical concerns. but something had shifted in me since finding the box, since hearing Mr. Davies's words, since seeing that fire in the sketched girl's eyes. Realistically, Clara, I cut her off, the edge in my voice sharper now. I'm not ready to discuss it today, and I would appreciate it if you stopped referring to my painting as nonsense. I could almost hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A beat of stunned silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken disapproval. "Fine," she said eventually, her voice tight, clipped. "But we will discuss it. Soon." The line clicked dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, trembling slightly. The defiance felt less exhilarating this time, more wearying, but necessary. It was a boundary drawn, a small patch of color asserted against the encroaching grip. My painting attempts continued, a frustrating cycle of fits and starts. Some days a flash of the old skill, the forgotten muscle memory returned, the way light kissed the curve of a petal, the precise angle of a branch against the sky. Other days it felt utterly hopeless, like trying to coax music from a broken instrument to escape the confines of the house and the weight of Clara's disapproval. I started sketching outdoors again, seeking refuge on park benches, trying to capture the fleeting moments of life around me, the frantic energy of squirrels, the slow dignity of ancient trees, the hurried postures of people rushing past. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden light slanted through the park trees, Leo found me there. He had his headphones around his neck, phone predictably in hand, but he stopped when he saw me sketching. "Grandma? What are you doing?" He ambled over, peering over my shoulder at the open sketchbook on my lap. I quickly tried to cover the page, embarrassed by the clumsy lines. "Whoa." He leaned closer, ignoring my attempt at concealment. "That's actually pretty good." I felt a ridiculous flush creep up my neck, a mix of pleasure and self-consciousness. "Oh, just scribbling, dear." "No, it's cool," he insisted, pointing at a quick gestural sketch of a squirrel mid-leap. "You really caught how twitchy it looks, like it's about to zap away." He surprised me then by dropping onto the bench beside me, tucking his phone into his jacket pocket. He looked at the sketchbook again, then at me, his expression open, curious. "Did you used to do this a lot?" "A lifetime ago," I admitted, the words catching slightly in my throat. We talked then. Really talked, perhaps for the first time since he'd outgrown the need for bedtime stories. He asked about my art, who had taught me, mentioned Marcus Thorne, keeping the details vague, just a name from the past. He asked why I'd stopped. I gave him the sanitized version: marriage, family, responsibilities, the usual narrative I'd told myself for decades. He listened intently, his usual teenage wall of indifference seemingly dissolved by the shared focus on the sketchbook. When I mentioned needing help finding information online about specific watercolor techniques or preserving old paints, his eyes lit up. He pulled out his phone, not to retreat into his own world, but to bridge the gap into mine. "Easy," he said, his thumbs flying across the screen. "There are tons of tutorials, forums. Look, this channel reviews vintage art supplies, and this site has digitized old art manuals." A small, unexpected bridge formed between us that afternoon, fragile but real, built of shared curiosity, charcoal lines and the surprising common ground found between a teenager's digital fluency and his grandmother's forgotten analog passion. It felt like another small patch of defiant color blooming in the gray. The antique shop became a regular stop on my walks downtown. Mr. Davies, perhaps sensing my persistent curiosity, or maybe just resigned to my presence, grew marginally less gruff. Our conversations, wedged between discussions of chipped porcelain and dusty furniture, invariably circled back to Marcus Thorne. I learned that the Thorne family had been influential, even formidable, in the town decades ago. Timber money, as Mr. Davies had said, which translated into social standing and a certain untouchable arrogance. They lived in a large, imposing house on Cedar Hill, a place locals spoke of with a mixture of awe and resentment. Old Mrs. Thorne, Mr. Davies elaborated one afternoon, squinting as he examined a tarnished silver frame, ran that family like a military campaign. Especially after her husband passed, Marcus was the artistic one, the sensitive one, always felt like a square peg in their very round hole. He paused, holding the frame up to the light. Heard she disapproved of his artistic inclinations, wanted him in the family business, timber or banking, something solid, not messing about with paint, disapproved of his art, or disapproved of the company he kept. The question lingered, unspoken but heavy. I started visiting the local library, digging through microfilmed archives of old newspapers from 60 years ago. The process was slow, tedious, my eyes aching from squinting at the flickering gray text. I found mentions of the Thorne family, society events, business dealings, philanthropic donations, but nothing about Marcus's sudden departure. No announcement of an inheritance, no mention of a trip to Italy. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist in the public record around that time. The absence felt louder than any headline. Meanwhile, my painting became a necessary outlet, a place to pour the swirling emotions, the rekindled hope, the growing anger, the gnawing uncertainty. The spare room began to transform. Canvases leaned against the walls. Jars filled with brushes cluttered the small table. The scent of watercolor paper and fixative subtly perfumed the air. There were still frustrating days when my hand refused to obey, when the colors turned to mud. But there were also moments of pure, exhilarating flow, when the brush seemed to move on its own, translating the image in my mind onto the paper with a clarity that surprised me. Leo became a semi-regular visitor. He'd drop by after school, ostensibly to raid the cookie jar, but would often linger, watching me paint or showing me things on his tablet. He downloaded digital painting apps, experimenting with brushes and layers, asking my opinion on colors. He helped me research obscure pigments online, track down forums where artists discussed restoring vintage watercolors. He even helped me set up a better lighting system in my makeshift studio, rigging up an old lamp with a daylight bulb he'd ordered. "Grandma," he said one afternoon, watching me struggle to mix a specific shade of stormy gray for a coastal scene, "why don't you try this digitally first? You can test out colors, layers, undo mistakes easily." He showed me an app on his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. I was hesitant at first. The technology felt alien, but under his patient guidance I started experimenting. It was different, yes, but strangely freeing in its own way. Another bridge built, this one of pixels and styluses. Clara, however, remained firmly rooted in the practical world. Her visits became less frequent after our initial confrontation, but the tension was palpable when she did come. One Saturday morning she arrived with a determined look on her face and another set of brochures, this time for assisted living facility. "Mom," she began, setting the glossy pamphlet squarely on my kitchen table, right next to a half-finished sketch of Leo. "I've done some research. These places offer security, meals, activities. It would be much more sensible, much safer for you than rattling around in this big house alone, especially now that you're preoccupied." The implication hung in the air, preoccupied with my nonsense. Safer for me, or more convenient for her? The familiar wave of resentment washed over me, but this time it was mixed with a weary resolve. "Clara," I said, my voice low but steady, not rising to the bait. "We've had this discussion. I am not moving." "But Mom, it's not practical. The upkeep, the stairs. What if you fall? And this painting thing." She gestured vaguely towards my easel, visible from the kitchen doorway. "It's lovely that you have a hobby, truly, but you need to be realistic." "Realistic?" I met her gaze. "Is it realistic to spend the last years of my life in a beige room waiting for bingo night because it's sensible? Is it realistic to ignore something that makes me feel alive again? Something I gave up 60 years ago, possibly because someone else decided it wasn't sensible then?" Clara frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "What are you talking about? Who decided?" "Marcus Thorne's mother, perhaps," I said, the name dropping into the conversation like a stone into a still pond. "The Thornes of Cedar Hill. Do you know them?" Clara blinked, surprised. "The Thornes? I mean, I know the name, everyone does. Old family, very wealthy. Why?" "Because Marcus Thorne was my teacher, my mentor," I explained, watching her face closely. "And according to Mr. Davies at the antique shop, his mother was a controlling woman who likely disapproved of her son's artistic pursuits, and perhaps his choice of company." Clara stared at me, confusion warring with dawning suspicion. "What are you implying, Mom? That this Marcus person, that his mother had something to do with you stopping painting 60 years ago?" She shook her head, dismissing it. "That sounds far-fetched. You married Dad, you had me. You chose that life." "Did I?" I asked softly. "Or was the choice made for me, in ways I'm only just beginning to understand?" I picked up the fragile letter I'd found, the one asking me to wait. "He didn't leave for Italy, Clara. He wrote this. He asked me to wait. His family disapproved." Clara read the letter, her brow furrowed. She looked from the letter to me, then back again, clearly unsettled. "Mom, this is ancient history. Even if it's true, what does it matter now?" "It matters," I said firmly, "because it means the foundation of the sensible life I built might have been based on a lie. And it matters because I won't let anyone, not Marcus Thorne's mother then, and not you now, dictate what I do with the time I have left. The confrontation hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Clara looked shaken. Her usual practical certainty rattled. She gathered her brochures again, her movements stiff. I need to go, she stammered, avoiding my eyes. We'll talk later. As the door closed behind her, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a strange clarity. The lines were drawn. My past was demanding attention, and my present required defending. And somewhere, in the intersection of the two, lay the truth about Marcus Thorne and the colors I had locked away for far too long. The mystery wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. The conversation with Clara, unsettling as it was, solidified my resolve. I wouldn't be deterred, not by practicality, not by doubt, not by the ghosts of the past. The mystery surrounding Marcus Thorne and the abrupt end to my artistic beginnings pulsed beneath the surface of my days, a constant hum of unanswered questions. Italy felt wrong. The silence felt wrong. I redoubled my efforts at the library, spending hours hunched over the microfilm reader, scanning local newspapers from that specific year, 1964, the year Marcus vanished from my life. This time, I looked not just for mentions of Marcus, but for anything related to the Thorne family, particularly Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, his mother. There were articles about her charity work, her hosting of garden parties, her presence at town council meetings, a pillar of the community, seemingly benign, but there was nothing about Marcus, nothing about Italy, nothing about an inheritance. The silence in the press regarding him was deafening. Mr. Davies became my reluctant confidant. I'd bring him coffee, browse his dusty shelves, and casually steer the conversation back to the Thornes. He'd grunt, polish something absently, and occasionally drop another breadcrumb. Eleanor Thorne, he mused one rainy afternoon, rolling condensation from his shop window, ruled that family with an iron fist. Her husband, decent enough fellow, but completely under her thumb, died youngish, left her in charge of everything. She had plans for Marcus, big plans. Banking, maybe politics. Art wasn't part of the picture. But why would she send him away? I pressed gently. Why lie about Italy? Mr. Davies shrugged, turning back to his counter. Control, maybe? Get him away from distractions. He gave me that pointed look again. Or maybe it wasn't just about you, Agnes. Maybe there was something else going on with Marcus she wanted swept under the rug. Something else? The thought hadn't occurred to me. My focus had been entirely on our connection, the implied disapproval of me. Could there have been another reason for his mother to orchestrate such a dramatic departure? Another secret she needed buried? The idea spurred me on. I started painting with a new intensity, attempting a larger canvas, a more ambitious coastal scene inspired by Marcus's sketches, but infused with the turmoil and questions churning inside me. The blues were deeper, the grays stormier, the lone lighthouse standing defiant against crashing waves. It was cathartic, pouring the confusion and anger onto the canvas. Leo, sensing the shift, brought me books on color theory and composition he'd found online. "You're really getting serious now, Grandma," he commented, watching me mix a turbulent shade of Payne's gray. One evening, sifting through the wooden box again, hoping for another overlooked clue, my fingers brushed against a false bottom in the tray holding the paint tubes. It was loose. Hard pounding, I carefully pried it up. Beneath it lay another small flat compartment I hadn't noticed before. Inside was not a letter, but a small folded piece of newsprint, yellowed and brittle. It was a tiny announcement, tucked away in the social notices of the local paper, dated just weeks after Marcus's last letter to me. Thorne Ashworth engagement announced. Mrs. Isabel Ashworth, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reginald Ashworth of Boston, to Mr. Marcus Thorne. Engaged? To someone else? Just weeks after writing asking me to wait? The world tilted. The air left my lungs. This wasn't family pressure forcing him away. This looked like betrayal. Plain and simple. He'd chosen someone else. Someone wealthy, connected, approved of by his mother. The Italy story, the family pressure. Had that been the lie? Had he simply moved on, found someone more suitable, and concocted the story in his letters to soften the blow, to keep me waiting while he started a new life? The cold anger from before was replaced by a wave of nausea, the familiar bitter taste of heartbreak I thought I'd processed 60 years ago returning with a vengeance. The girl with fire in her eyes in that sketch suddenly looked like a fool. Had I wasted decades mourning a lie, only to uncover a different, more personal betrayal? I felt a desperate need for air, for perspective. The next day, impulsively, I drove out toward Cedar Hill. I wouldn't go to the Thorne mansion itself, but I wanted to see the place, the environment that had shaped him, that had perhaps dictated his choices. The area was still exclusive. Large houses set back from the road behind stone walls and manicured hedges. It felt like a different world from the small town streets where I lived, where Marcus and I had once shared art classes and hesitant conversations. As I drove slowly past the imposing stone gates of the Thorne estate, a flicker of movement caught my eye. An elderly woman was tending roses in the front garden, her back to the road. Even from a distance, there was an air of rigid authority about her posture. Could that be? No. Eleanor Thorne would be long gone, but perhaps a relative? A groundskeeper? On a sudden impulse, I parked down the street and walked back, approaching the gate hesitantly. As I got closer, the woman straightened up, turning slightly. She wasn't Mrs. Thorne. She was younger, perhaps late 60, yes, but bore a striking resemblance to photos I'd seen of the late Eleanor Thorne. She looked at me, her expression polite but questioning, clearly wondering what this stranger was doing loitering outside the gates. Before I could lose my nerve, I spoke. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice thinner than I intended. "I was wondering. I used to know someone who lived here a long time ago, Marcus Thorne." The woman's polite expression froze. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Marcus?" Her voice was cool, clipped. "He hasn't lived here in decades. He passed away years ago." "Passed away?" My blood ran cold. "Passed away?" I stammered. "But Italy. Mr. Davies at the antique shop said he went to Italy. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the woman's face. Annoyance? Or perhaps satisfaction? Italy? She gave a short, dismissive laugh. Marcus never went to Italy. He died in a sanatorium, not long after that engagement was announced, actually. Poor dear. Always was fragile. She turned back to her roses, snipping a dead bloom with finality, clearly dismissing me in the conversation. Sanatorium? Fragile? Died shortly after the engagement? None of this made sense. It contradicted everything. Marcus's letters, Mr. Davies's story, the engagement announcement itself. My mind reeled. Had Mr. Davies lied? Had this woman lied? Or was the truth something far more complex and perhaps deliberately obscured than I had ever imagined? The engagement, the sudden death in a sanatorium, it felt less like a tragic illness and more like another piece of a carefully constructed puzzle, designed 60 years ago to hide something the Thorns desperately wanted buried. And I had the sinking feeling that my connection to Marcus was somehow at the heart of it all. I drove away from Cedar Hill in a daze, the woman's words echoing in my mind. Sanatorium, fragile, died. It felt like a deliberate distortion, another layer of obfuscation peeled back only to reveal more beneath. Marcus fragile? The intense, passionate artist I remembered? It didn't track. And dying so soon after an engagement announcement, it felt too convenient, too neat, especially coupled with the conflicting story of Italy. My first stop was back at Mr. Davies' shop. I needed to confront him, to understand why he told me Marcus went to Italy if it wasn't true. I walked in, the bell jingling sharply, my resolve hardening with every step. "Mr. Davies?" I said, skipping pleasantries. That woman at the Thorn estate, perhaps a relative? She told me Marcus Thorn died in a sanatorium 60 years ago, not long after his engagement. She said he never went to Italy. Mr. Davies stopped dusting a porcelain figurine, his hand hovering mid-air. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally looked me straight in the eye, his usual gruffness replaced by something akin to pity. "Sit down, Agnes," he said, gesturing to a rickety stool behind the counter. He leaned against the shelves, folding his arms. "All right, maybe it's time you knew the version I heard. Not the official story, mind you, but the whispers. The things people said after the Thorns shut everything down." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Marcus wasn't fragile, Agnes. Not in the way she meant. He was different. Sensitive, yes. Artistic. Didn't fit the Thorns' mold. And he was in love." He paused again, his gaze steady on mine. "With you." My breath caught. "Old Mrs. Thorn couldn't abide it," he continued, his voice low. "You, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, no money, no name, distracting her precious son from his predestined path. She tried everything to break you two up, didn't she?" I nodded mutely, remembering subtle pressures, veiled warnings, the sudden chill from Marcus's mother whenever I encountered her. "When that didn't work," Mr. Davies went on, "she played her trump card, Isabel Ashworth, Perfect pedigree, perfect connections. An arranged engagement, pure and simple. Marcus fought it, apparently, threatened to walk away from everything. That's likely when he wrote you that last letter, the one asking you to wait. My hands clenched around the memory of those hopeful, desperate words. But Eleanor Thorne wasn't one to be defied, Mr. Davies said grimly. The story goes she gave him an ultimatum: marry Isabel, accept his place, or she'd make sure you suffered consequences, ruin your reputation, make sure you never got into art school. Maybe worse, leverage, blackmail, essentially. He shook his head, faced with that, seeing no way out, hearing his mother had perhaps intercepted letters from you. Marcus broke in. He had some kind of breakdown. The sanatorium, I whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Exactly, Mr. Davies confirmed. Not Italy. A private rest home, upstate, conveniently far away. And yes, he died there, within the year. Official cause? Pneumonia, they said. But folks whispered neglect, maybe. Or maybe just a broken heart. Easier for the Thornes to manage than a scandal, or a son who wouldn't comply. The Italy story, pure fabrication, a neat way to close the book, ensure no one asked too many questions, especially not you. He looked at me, his eyes full of a surprising gentleness. She wanted you gone, Agnes. Wanted you to believe he'd abandoned you so you'd move on, disappear from their perfect world. And it worked, didn't it? The air rushed out of me. 60 years. 60 years of believing a lie, first of abandonment, then of family pressure leading to a departure. The truth was colder, crueler. Manipulation, blackmail, a forced engagement, a breakdown, a lonely death in a sanatorium, all orchestrated by a ruthless woman determined to protect her family's name and control her son's destiny. And my life, my choices, giving up art, marrying Thomas, settling into that gray, sensible existence, had all been predicated on that elaborate, devastating deception. The anger I felt before was nothing compared to the cold, hard rage that settled in my chest now. It wasn't hot. It was glacial, a fury 60 years in the making. I thanked Mr. Davies, my voice hollow, walked out of the shop into the afternoon sun, seeing the familiar street through entirely new eyes. Everything felt tainted, shadowed by the lie. I didn't go straight home. I drove to the coast, to Haven Point, the place captured in Marcus's energetic sketches. I stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping my hair, the gray sea churning below, mirroring the storm inside me. I thought about the girl with fire in her eyes. They hadn't just dimmed her light. They had tried to extinguish it completely. They had stolen Marcus's future, and in doing so, they had stolen a piece of mine. That evening I didn't paint. I sat in my studio, surrounded by my canvases, and simply let the weight of the truth wash over me. It was a bitter tide, dragging up decades of buried grief and what if, but beneath the pain something else began to surface. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe never, but resolve. They had taken 60 years. They wouldn't take another minute. I picked up my largest canvas, the one I'd been saving. I mixed the stormiest grays, the deepest blues, the most defiant whites, and I began to paint. Not the landscape Marcus had sketched, but the storm itself, the churning sea, the jagged cliffs, the lighthouse standing tall against the onslaught. I poured all the rage, the grief, the betrayal, the resilience onto that canvas, brushstroke after brushstroke, layer after layer, until the canvas held the tempest not just of the sea, but of my soul. I worked through the night, fueled by coffee and a 60-year-old fury, until the first pale light of dawn touched the sky. When I finally stepped back, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, the painting dominated the room. It was raw, powerful, perhaps technically flawed, but undeniably mine. It was the truth, rendered in pigment and emotion. Later that morning, Clara arrived. She must have seen the light on all night. She walked into the studio, stopped short, and stared at the painting. Her usual practical demeanor faltered, her mouth slightly open. She looked from the turbulent canvas to me, standing there in my paint-splattered smock, exhausted but upright. "Mom," she whispered, her voice uncertain, filled with an emotion I hadn't heard from her before. Awe, perhaps, or maybe finally a glimmer of understanding. She didn't say anything else. She just looked at the painting, then back at me, and for the first time I felt like she truly saw me, not the sensible, fading mother, but the woman who had weathered the storm and was finally painting her own light back into the world. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Clara continued to stare at the painting, her gaze moving across the turbulent waves, the defiant White House, the stormy sky. Her usual mask of brisk efficiency had fallen away, leaving her looking younger, more vulnerable, and utterly bewildered. "What is this?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper, gesturing towards the canvas. "It's the truth," I replied simply, my voice rough with fatigue but steady, or part of it. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to recount the sordid details of Eleanor Thorne's manipulations, Marcus's tragic end, or the 60 years of a life lived under the shadow of a lie. The painting spoke for itself, a raw testament to the storm I had weathered internally for decades, the storm I was only now finding the language, the colors, to express. Clara looked from the painting back to me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time seeing beyond the roles of mother and grandmother. She saw the paint smudges on my cheeks, the exhaustion in my eyes, but also, I hoped, the flicker of the fire that hadn't quite been extinguished. "I had no idea," she stammered, shaking her head slightly. "All these years, you never said anything." "There was nothing to say," I answered wearily. "I didn't know the full story myself until recently, and besides, would you have listened?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but understood. She took a hesitant step closer to the painting. "It's powerful, Mom." It wasn't exactly an apology, not yet, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall of practicality she had built between us. "It needed to be," I said. She stayed for a while longer, unusually quiet, asking tentative questions not about downsizing or sensible choices, but about the painting, about the colors, about the feeling it evoked. It was the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one 60 years overdue. When she left, the brochures for assisted living were conspicuously absent. I've settled into a new rhythm after that. The revelation about Marcus and the subsequent confrontation with Clara didn't magically erase the past, but it shifted the present. I continued to paint, exploring not just landscapes, but the complex terrain of memory and emotion. My little studio gallery became a quiet hub, drawing neighbors, fellow art club members introduced by Mr. Davies, and occasionally curious strangers. My relationship with Clara slowly began to mend, rebuilt on a foundation of newfound, if fragile, honesty. She stopped pushing for me to move, occasionally bringing Leo over not just for duty visits, but sometimes just to sit quietly in the studio while I worked. Leo, inspired, dove deeper into his own art, digital and traditional, sharing his creations with me, seeking advice, treating me not just as grandmother, but as a fellow artist. The bridge between us solidified. Mr. Davies remained a constant, grumpy presence, shuffling into the gallery now and then, offering cryptic critiques. "Sky's a bit muddy there, Agnes," or "got the light right on that one," that I learned to interpret as high praise. He never spoke of the thorns again, and I never asked. Some stories are heavy enough without constant retelling. We shared a silent understanding, two keepers of a town's forgotten history. A wooden box found its permanent place on a prominent shelf in the studio, open. The dried paints, the stiff brushes, the faded letters, the brittle newspaper clipping, no longer ghosts of regret or symbols of betrayal, but artifacts of a journey, reminders of a passion rediscovered, a truth unearthed, and a life reclaimed fiercely, defiantly, beautifully. Sometimes, usually in the quiet light of late afternoon, I'd stand before that painting of the storm. I'd trace the lines of the lighthouse beam cutting through the darkness, feel the spray of the crashing waves, hear the howl of the wind captured in the turbulent blues and graves. It wasn't a painting of despair. It was a painting of resilience. And I would look at my own reflection in the window glass, the silver hair, the lined face, the eyes that had seen too much but now held a quiet clarity. The girl with fire in her eyes wasn't just a memory in a sketchbook anymore. She was here, older, yes, scarred certainly, but present, real, and finally painting her own damn light. She was home.